Imagine the dust of 1,000 soldiers choking the air, the screams of the dying swallowed by the clash of iron. It's August 2nd, 216 BC, near the plains of Cannae. You are a Roman legionary, and you've just watched 50,000 of your brothers fall in a single afternoon. The man who did this. He wasn't some barbarian king. He was Hannibal Barca, a general from the city of Carthage, who had marched elephants over the Alps just to bring Rome to its knees. But here's the real question that haunts history: why did two of the ancient world's greatest powers hate each other enough to burn the Mediterranean for over a century? This wasn't just a war. It was a blood feud between an unstoppable empire and an immovable republic. And the seeds of that hatred? They were planted long before the first trumpet ever sounded. To understand this inferno, you have to rewind the clock. Forget Rome, the eternal city, the marble wonder. In the 4th century BC, Rome was just a mid-sized Italian town, a scrappy republic fighting for its life against hill tribes and rival cities. It was a culture obsessed with discipline, farming, and the terrifying idea that your duty to the state outweighed your own life. Every citizen was a soldier. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, Carthage was the complete opposite. Born from Phoenician traders, it was a city of merchants, a naval superpower whose wealth was so vast that its ships were said to sail on silver. It didn't want land, it wanted gold. It didn't field citizen armies, it hired mercenaries from Spain, North Africa, and Gaul. These were two worlds on a collision course, separated by a sea that was about to become a lake of fire. The spark that lit the powder keg wasn't even in their own backyards. It was an island, Sicily. The breadbasket of the Mediterranean. In 288 BC, a group of mercenaries called the Mamertines, who had seized the city of Messana, found themselves in trouble. They were being squeezed by the powerful city of Syracuse. Desperate, they made a choice. Half of them appealed to Carthage for protection, the other half to Rome. For Rome, this was the moment of destiny. Sending an army to Sicily meant direct confrontation with Carthage. The Roman Senate was terrified. They knew Carthage's navy was unmatched. But their ambition was even stronger. They couldn't let the Carthaginians control the strait that separated Italy from Sicily. So, Rome did the unthinkable. They broke a treaty and crossed into Sicily. The Carthaginians saw this as an act of war. And so, in 264 BC, the First Punic War began, a conflict that would drag on for 23 brutal years. But Rome had a major problem. To defeat Carthage, they had to cross the sea. And Carthage ruled the waves. Their warships were sleek, fast, and crewed by sailors who had spent their entire lives on the water. The Romans were farmers. They were great at fighting on land, but put them on a ship and they'd be seasick before the battle even started. So, what did Rome do? They looked at a wrecked Carthaginian quinquereme, a massive warship, and they reverse-engineered it. They built a fleet of over 100 ships in record time. But they knew they'd still be outmaneuvered. So they invented a secret weapon. They called it the corvus, the crow. A heavy boarding bridge with a massive iron spike. When a Roman ship got close to an enemy, they'd drop the bridge, the spike would slam into the enemy deck, locking the ships together. Suddenly, a sea battle became a land battle, and Romans were the best land soldiers in the world. This insane invention worked. The Roman navy, using the corvus, won victory after victory, turning the tide of the war. They even invaded North Africa, threatening Carthage itself. But the war dragged on, bleeding both sides dry. After more than 2 decades of slaughter, a Roman general named Catullus finally forced a decisive naval battle at the Aegates Islands in 241 BC. This time, the Romans didn't even need the corvus. They had become better sailors. They crushed the Carthaginian fleet. Carthage was bankrupt and exhausted. They had to sue for peace. They lost Sicily, paid a massive indemnity, and were humiliated on the world stage. Rome had won the First Punic War. But in defeat, Carthage was not finished. They were just sharpening their claws. And from the ashes of that defeat would rise a man who swore an eternal oath of hatred against Rome. A boy named Hannibal. Rome celebrated. They thought the threat was over. They thought Carthage was a broken power, a beaten dog. They were dangerously wrong. Because Carthage, though defeated, was a phoenix. They turned their attention to Spain, to the rich silver mines of the Iberian Peninsula, and rebuilt their wealth and their army under a brilliant new general, Hannibal Barca. And it was here, in front of the altar of the god Baal, that Hannibal made his young son, Hannibal, swear a terrible oath of eternal enmity against Rome. So, as Rome looked east, drunk on victory, a new storm was brewing in the west. A storm led by a man who would soon march an army, and a herd of war elephants, over the snow-capped Alps to strike at the heart of the Republic. The First War was just the prelude. The real horror, the legend of Hannibal, was about to begin. What was he planning? And how could one man hope to challenge the might of Rome? The oath was sworn, but the fire in Hannibal's heart needed fuel. That fuel came in 219 BC, in the form of a city called Saguntum. Saguntum was a Roman ally, a thorn in Carthage's side, sitting just south of the Ebro River, the line that supposedly divided their spheres of influence. Hannibal knew that attacking Saguntum would be an act of war against Rome. But he also knew something else. Rome was distracted, entangled in Illyrian piracy, and would hesitate to defend a city so far from home. So he laid siege. The city held out for 8 brutal months, its defenders fighting with the desperation of the doomed. While Saguntum burned, Roman envoys sailed to Carthage, demanding Hannibal be handed over for justice. The Carthaginian Senate, emboldened by Hannibal's victories and his growing power, refused. The die was cast. The Second Punic War was now inevitable. Hannibal had not just declared war on Rome, he had forced Rome to declare it on him. Now, Hannibal had a plan, and it was audacious beyond measure. Rome expected him to invade Italy by sea, just as they had invaded Africa in the last war. But Hannibal knew his fleet was no match for Rome's. So he decided to do the unthinkable, march his army overland from Spain, across the Pyrenees, through the heart of Gaul, and over the Alps into Italy. It was a journey of over 1,000 miles, through hostile tribes, treacherous terrain, and the deadliest mountains in Europe. No army had ever attempted such a feat with war elephants. But Hannibal was not just a general, he was a master of psychological warfare. He knew that showing up in Italy with an army that had marched through the impossible would demoralize the Romans before a single sword was drawn. So in the summer of 218 BC, he left his base in Carthago Nova with an army of around 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants. This was not just a military campaign, it was a statement of defiance that would echo through history. The march began with a reputation to protect. The tribes of Spain and Gaul were fierce warriors, and they knew that a Carthaginian army crossing their lands was a threat to their own independence. Hannibal faced ambush after ambush. He had to fight his way through the Pyrenees, losing thousands of men to skirmishes and desertion. When he finally reached the Rhone River in southern Gaul, he found his path blocked by a massive force of Gallic warriors, the Volsi, who had gathered on the opposite bank to prevent his crossing. But Hannibal was a genius at improvisation. He sent a detachment of his forces upstream, under the cover of darkness, to cross the river on rafts and boats. At dawn, while the Gauls were focused on Hannibal's main army, the detachment attacked them from the rear. Panic swept through the Gallic ranks. They broke and fled. Hannibal had won a crossing, but at a cost. The Rhone was just the beginning. The Alps, with their snow, ice, and narrow passes, were waiting. But the Rhone was a test of will, and Hannibal passed it. Yet, as he prepared to march north, he received terrifying news: a Roman army, led by the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, had landed at Massilia, a Greek colony on the coast, directly in his path. Scipio had been expecting to find Hannibal in Spain, but instead, he found him in Gaul. The two armies were now only a few days' march apart. Hannibal had a choice: turn and fight the Romans, or continue his march and hope to outrun them. He chose to evade. He knew that a battle now would be costly, even if he won, and it would delay his main objective, the Alps. So he marched his army north, up the Rhone valley, leaving Scipio behind. Scipio, realizing he had missed his chance, sent his brother Aeneas with most of the army to continue the campaign in Spain, while he himself returned to Italy to await Hannibal's arrival. Hannibal had escaped the trap, but now he was racing against time and the coming winter. The Alps were a death sentence, and he had to cross them before the passes closed. Hannibal's army was a melting pot of cultures: Libyans, Numidians, Iberians, Gauls, and even a few Greeks, all bound together by loyalty to their general and the promise of plunder. They moved with terrifying speed, but the Alps were unforgiving. The passes were narrow, the slopes steep, and the snow was already beginning to fall. The local tribes, the Allobroges, watched from the heights, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the Carthaginian column snaked through a particularly treacherous gorge, the Gauls attacked, rolling rocks down the cliffs and showering the troops with arrows and javelins. Panic erupted. Men and animals were crushed, fell into the abyss, or were impaled on rocks below. Hannibal, ever the leader, ordered his men to hold their ground, while he himself led a detachment of light infantry up the slopes to dislodge the attackers. It was a savage, desperate fight, but Hannibal's men prevailed. They secured the pass, but at a terrible price. Thousands of his soldiers lay dead in the gorge. The elephants, terrified, were barely under control. The worst was yet to come. By the time they reached the summit of the pass, Hannibal's army was a shadow of its former self. He had started with nearly 40,000 men after the Rhone crossing. Now, he had barely 26,000. Many had died in the ambushes, but many more had deserted. They were broken by the cold, the hunger, and the constant fear. The men were exhausted, frostbitten, and demoralized. But Hannibal, standing at the top of the pass, pointed down into the green plains of Italy. He gave one of the most famous speeches in military history. He reminded them that they were not just fighting for Carthage, but for their own survival. He told them that they were standing on the very threshold of Rome, that the enemy was weak, and that victory was within their grasp. He promised them glory, gold, and revenge. The soldiers, inspired by his words and their own desperate situation, rallied. They began the descent. It was even more treacherous than the climb. The path was icy, and the elephants, their feet bleeding, slipped and fell, dragging men to their deaths. By the time Hannibal reached the Italian plains in the spring of 217 BC, he had lost over half of his army. But he was here, in Italy, with a force that was still dangerous, and the Romans had no idea what had just hit them. The question that hung in the air, as Hannibal's army emerged from the mountains, was, what happens now? And which Roman general would be brave or foolish enough to face the man who had just crossed the impossible? The snow was still melting off their armor when the first Roman scout spotted them. The sight was terrifying, an army of ghosts emerging from the frozen peaks, led by a man who had done the impossible. The Romans had assumed Hannibal would never make it. They were wrong. But the Roman Republic was not the type to sit behind walls and wait. They sent their armies, not one, but two, to crush this invading force before it could find its footing. The first to make contact was a newly raised army under the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was a capable general, but he was facing a master of war. The two forces met near the Ticinus River, a tributary of the Po. Scipio, eager for a quick victory, ordered his cavalry and light infantry forward to probe the Carthaginian lines. It was a reckless move, and Hannibal saw it instantly. He knew he could not win a straight-up fight against the full might of Rome, not yet. So he set a trap. Hannibal's trap was simple, yet devastating. He placed his best cavalry, the Numidians, in hiding on the flanks, and sent a smaller force to provoke the Romans into a charge. The Roman cavalry, eager for glory, took the bait and thundered forward. They crashed into the Carthaginian line, and for a moment, it seemed they would break through. But then the Numidians struck from the sides, howling like wolves, their javelins filling the air. The Romans were surrounded and cut down in a vicious melee. The consul Scipio himself was wounded, bleeding from a spear thrust to his shoulder. He was surrounded, his guards dead, when a young man, his own son, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, charged into the fray. The boy, just 17 years old, rode straight for his father, his sword flashing. He cut down the attacking Numidians, pulled his father onto his own horse, and escaped. This was the first time the name Scipio would be etched into the history of this war, but it would not be the last. The Battle of Ticinus was a Roman defeat, a humiliating one, but it was just a prelude to the disaster that was about to unfold. The defeat at Ticinus sent a shockwave through Rome. The other consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was in Sicily with his army, preparing to invade Africa. He was ordered to rush north and join forces with the wounded Scipio. Sempronius was a proud and ambitious man. He saw Hannibal as a threat to his own glory, and he was determined to engage him in a decisive battle. Hannibal, of course, knew this. He knew Sempronius was hot-headed and eager for a fight. So he prepared his next masterpiece. The Trebia River, a tributary of the Po, was the chosen ground. It was a cold, rainy day in December. Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry to cross the river, harass the Roman camp, and then retreat, luring the Romans across the freezing water. The Romans, furious at this insult, took the bait. They crossed the Trebia, soaking wet and freezing, only to find Hannibal's army waiting for them in battle formation on the far bank. The Romans were exhausted before the first spear was thrown. The Battle of Trebia was a massacre. As the Romans formed up, shivering and exhausted, Hannibal unleashed his secret weapon. He had hidden a force of 2,000 picked men, led by his brother Mago, in the tall grass and reeds of a nearby stream. As the Roman line advanced, Mago's men burst out from their hiding place, slamming into the Roman rear. The Romans were caught in a pincer, surrounded on all sides. They fought with the desperation of cornered animals, but it was hopeless. They were cut down in droves, their blood turning the cold water of the Trebia red. Only a small force, about 10,000 men, managed to cut their way out and escape the carnage. Sempronius himself barely made it out alive. The rest of his army, tens of thousands of men, were dead, wounded, or captured. The road to Italy was now wide open. Hannibal, his army now rich with captured Roman weapons and armor, made camp for the winter. He had won 2 battles in 2 months. But he knew this was not enough. He needed to break Rome's will to fight, not just defeat its armies. The winter of 218 BC was a time of panic and dread in Rome. The city was in a state of emergency. The Senate had lost 2 armies, and the new enemy was camped in the valley of the Po, just a week's march away. They needed new commanders, and they needed them fast. They turned to a man named Gaius Flaminius, a populist politician who had been elected consul for the year 217 BC. Flaminius was a man of action, but he was also arrogant and impulsive. He was not a general, he was a rabble-rouser. He raised a new army, some 40,000 strong, and marched north to meet Hannibal. He was determined to do what Scipio and Sempronius had failed to do, destroy Hannibal in a single, decisive battle. Hannibal, watching from his winter camp, saw Flaminius coming. He knew his enemy's weakness, his pride. So he began to march, and he began to provoke. He burned farms and villages, sending smoke signals across the countryside, taunting Flaminius to follow him. It was a dangerous game. Hannibal was marching blindly through unfamiliar territory, but he knew that Flaminius' rage would cloud his judgment. Flaminius took the bait. He marched his army after Hannibal with reckless speed, ignoring the advice of his officers who warned him of an ambush. He was so close to Hannibal that he could see the smoke from the burning farms. He was furious, and his fury blinded him. He followed Hannibal into the narrow valley of Lake Trasimene, a place where the hills came down to the water's edge, leaving only a narrow strip of land. It was a death trap. Hannibal had placed his troops on the hills above the valley, waiting for the Romans to march into the trap. As Flaminius' army filed into the foggy valley, the Carthaginians struck. They came down from the hills, from all sides, enveloping the Roman column in a terrifying ambush. The Romans were not even in formation, they were marching in a long line. They were slaughtered where they stood. Flaminius himself was killed, his body never recovered. The battle was a massacre, 15,000 Romans were killed, and thousands more were taken prisoner. The rest fled in panic. Hannibal had just destroyed a third Roman army. He was now the undisputed master of Italy, and the city of Rome itself lay almost defenseless. The question was no longer if he would march on Rome, but when. What would he find when he got there? The smoke from Lake Trasimene hadn't even cleared before the news hit Rome like a thunderbolt. 15,000 Roman citizens, fathers, brothers, sons, lay dead in a blood-soaked valley, and their consul, Gaius Flaminius, was among the missing, his body never to be found. The city erupted in panic. The gates were closed, bridges were cut, and the Senate met in emergency session. They knew Hannibal was out there, somewhere, with his army of barbarians and mercenaries, and Rome had no army left to stop him. In this moment of absolute crisis, the Romans did something they hadn't done in decades, they appointed a dictator. A single man with absolute power, for 6 months, to do whatever it took to save the Republic. And the man they chose was not a fiery young general, but a cautious, seasoned senator named Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius was a man of the old school, patient, calculating, and deeply suspicious of glory. He knew that Hannibal was a genius at set-piece battles, that he could outfight any Roman army in a fair contest. So Fabius decided to fight a different kind of war. He marched his new army out of Rome, but he refused to meet Hannibal in battle. Instead, he shadowed the Carthaginians like a ghost, always a few miles away, watching, waiting, cutting off their supply lines, and harassing their foraging parties. It was frustrating, unglamorous work. His soldiers called him Cunctator, the delayer, a nickname meant as an insult. They wanted to fight, they wanted revenge for Trasimene. But Fabius was unwavering. He knew that Hannibal was far from home, that his army was shrinking, and that time was on Rome's side. He was playing a long game, and he was determined to win it, even if it meant enduring the scorn of his own people. But Fabius's strategy was about to be tested like never before. Hannibal, frustrated by Fabius's refusal to fight, decided to force his hand. He marched his army through the richest farmlands of Italy, Campania, the breadbasket of the peninsula. He burned villages, destroyed crops, and drove off livestock. The smoke of 1,000 fires darkened the sky. It was a direct provocation, a slap in the face of the Roman Republic. The farmers and landowners screamed for protection. The Senate demanded action. And Fabius's own master of horse, his second-in-command, a hot-headed noble named Marcus Minucius Rufus, was openly mocking him as a coward. The pressure was immense. Every day, Hannibal was ravaging the countryside, and every day, Fabius did nothing. He followed the Carthaginians, but he refused to engage. He was watching, waiting for the perfect moment. And then, in the summer of 217 BC, the moment seemed to come. Hannibal had led his army into a trap. He had marched into a valley near the town of Casilinum, and the Romans had quickly blocked the exits. Fabius saw his chance. He seized the high ground and prepared to crush the Carthaginians. But Hannibal, ever the trickster, had one more card to play. He ordered his men to tie burning torches to the horns of 2,000 cattle and drive them up the mountain slopes at night. The Romans, seeing the flaming shapes moving in the darkness, thought the Carthaginians were attempting a breakout. They abandoned their posts to chase the phantom army. Hannibal then slipped his entire force through an unguarded pass, escaping the trap without losing a single man. When Fabius discovered what had happened, he was furious, but he was also relieved. He had come close to losing his entire army in a single blunder. The incident only deepened the hatred his soldiers felt for him. They believed he was either a coward or a traitor. And in Rome, the political knives were being sharpened. The escape at Casilinum was a humiliation, and it broke the back of Fabius's authority. His master of horse, Minucius, returned to Rome and launched a blistering attack on the dictator's leadership. He accused Fabius of being a coward, of wanting to see Rome burn, of being in league with the Carthaginians. The people, hungry for a hero, listened. They had seen Hannibal ravage their lands for months, and they were tired of waiting. They wanted a battle. In a bold move, the Senate passed a law giving Minucius equal command with Fabius, a violation of the traditional dictatorship that had never been done before. The Republic was tearing itself apart, and Hannibal, watching from his camp, must have smiled. He knew that Rome's greatest weapon was its unity, and that unity was now shattered. He would now have to face two Roman armies, but he would face them separately, and he knew exactly how to deal with each. The split command was a disaster waiting to happen. Minucius, eager to prove himself, immediately sought battle with Hannibal, and he got it, but on Hannibal's terms. Hannibal lured Minucius into a trap, and only Fabius's timely arrival saved the Roman army from annihilation. Minucius, humbled, acknowledged Fabius as his superior and returned to the strategy of delay. But the damage was done. Hannibal had spent the entire summer marching through Italy, and the Romans had done nothing to stop him. The public's patience was exhausted. The Senate knew they needed a new approach. They could not let Hannibal run loose in Italy forever. They would have to meet him in a decisive battle, and they would have to win. In the autumn of 216 BC, they raised the largest army Rome had ever assembled, 8 legions, over 80,000 men, and they placed it under the command of 2 new consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. They were determined to crush Hannibal once and for all. But Hannibal was waiting for them, and he had a plan that would change the course of history. The stage was set for the greatest battle of the ancient world. But that, my friends, is a story for another time. What happened at Cannae? Who would survive the slaughter? And would Rome itself fall? You don't want to miss the next episode. Subscribe now, and let's find out together. The Roman army marching south was a spectacle of pride and fear, 80,000 men, the largest force the Republic had ever fielded, moving like a bronze-scaled serpent through the Italian countryside. But Hannibal watched them from the hills, and he saw not a monster, but a trap waiting to be sprung. He knew the Roman command was divided, Paulus, the cautious veteran, and Varro, the populist firebrand who promised victory in a single afternoon. So Hannibal did something audacious. He moved his camp to the village of Cannae, a tiny granary on the Aufidus River, and he placed his back to the sea. It was a position with no retreat, a desperate gamble that screamed, "Come and get me." And the Romans, eager to end this war, took the bait. They formed their lines on the plain, their heavy infantry packed so deep that their own soldiers could barely lift their swords. They outnumbered Hannibal 2-1. And they had no idea that they were walking into the most perfect killing machine ever devised by a military mind. As the Roman legions advanced, their sheer mass was terrifying. Over 80,000 men, their armor glinting in the summer sun, their standards waving like a forest of eagles. They were confident, even arrogant, convinced that their weight of numbers would simply crush the Carthaginian line. But Hannibal saw their formation and knew he had won the battle before a single blow was struck. He arranged his own troops in a crescent, with his weakest infantry, the Gauls and Spaniards, in the center, bulging forward toward the enemy. On his flanks, he placed his elite African infantry, veterans who had followed him from Spain, hidden and waiting. The plan was as simple as it was deadly: the center would bend, but it would not break. It would draw the Roman legions in, deep into the pocket, and then the flanks would close like a pair of iron jaws. The Romans, seeing the Carthaginian center buckle, would surge forward, thinking they were winning, unaware that they were being drawn into a sack from which there was no escape. The collision was deafening. The Roman infantry smashed into the Carthaginian center, and for a moment, it seemed like the battle would be over in minutes. The Gauls and Spaniards, fighting in the center, began to give way, step by step, just as Hannibal had ordered. The Romans, sensing victory, pressed harder, screaming their war cries, pushing deeper and deeper into the pocket. They were so focused on the crumbling center that they didn't notice the clouds of dust on their flanks, the dust kicked up by Hannibal's cavalry and his hidden African infantry. Then, the trap snapped shut. The Carthaginian cavalry, led by Hasdrubal, had routed the Roman cavalry on both wings, and now they wheeled around to strike the Roman rear. At the same time, the African infantry on the flanks turned inward and attacked the Roman columns from the sides. The Roman army, so confident just moments before, was now surrounded on all sides. There was no escape. They were packed so tightly that they couldn't even raise their weapons to defend themselves. The slaughter had begun. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. The Romans, packed into a human mass, were cut down where they stood. The Carthaginians, fighting with discipline and fury, advanced like a wave of death, their swords rising and falling in a terrible rhythm. The Roman soldiers couldn't even swing their weapons, there was no room. They died by the thousands, their bodies piling up in heaps, making the ground slippery with blood. The consul Paulus, the cautious veteran, was killed in the melee, his body trampled underfoot. His colleague Varro, the man who had promised a quick victory, managed to escape with a few hundred horsemen, fleeing the field in disgrace. By the end of the day, the sun was setting on a landscape of utter horror. The Roman army of 80,000 men had been annihilated. An estimated 70,000 Romans lay dead on the field, including senators, magistrates, and the flower of Roman aristocracy. Hannibal's losses were a fraction of that. It was the single worst military defeat in Roman history, a disaster so profound that it would haunt the Republic for generations. The news of Cannae hit Rome like a thunderbolt. For days, the city was in a state of panic, expecting Hannibal to appear at the gates at any moment. The Senate, in a desperate measure, appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus, now known as the Delayer, to lead the city's defense. But the situation was dire. Rome had lost nearly a fifth of its adult male population in a single day. Every family in the city had lost a father, a son, or a brother. The treasury was empty, and the army was in ruins. Yet, in the midst of this catastrophe, a young man emerged, a man who would become Rome's greatest hero. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, the same teenager who had saved his father's life at the Battle of Ticinus. He was only 19 years old, but he was already a military tribune. After Cannae, He gathered the survivors, the shattered remnants of the Roman legions, and he forged them into a new force. He was a man of a new generation, one who understood that to defeat Hannibal, they would have to learn from him, not just fight him. But that was a lesson for the future. For now, Rome was on its knees, and the greatest question of the age was, would it ever rise again? But even as Rome licked its wounds, Hannibal was making a decision that would define the rest of the war. He was not marching on Rome, despite his stunning victory. He sent his cavalry commander, Hannibal, to urge him to strike immediately. Hannibal famously said, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." Hannibal, however, chose to wait. He believed that Rome would sue for peace, that the Republic would crumble now that its army was gone. He was wrong. The Senate, in a moment of fierce defiance, refused to even discuss peace. They forbade the word peace to be spoken in the city, and they raised new legions from the very citizens who had lost everything. Hannibal's moment of decision, to march on Rome or to consolidate his gains, is one of the great what-ifs of history. What if he had marched? Would Rome have fallen? Would the world have been Carthaginian? We will never know for certain, but the choice he made set the stage for a war of attrition that would drag on for another 14 years. And in that long, grinding conflict, a new Roman hero would rise, a man who would take the war to Africa and turn Hannibal's own tactics against him. But that, my friends, is a story for another time. What was this new strategy that would save Rome? Who was this young Scipio, and what did he see that no one else did? And how far would he go to win? Subscribe now, and let's uncover the next chapter of this epic struggle together. The smoke from Cannae still choked the sky, but Hannibal wasn't savoring the victory. He was counting the cost. His army, battered and bleeding, was now deep in enemy territory, far from home. He had won the battle, but he hadn't won the war. Rome refused to break. The Senate's defiance was a cold, hard wall. So, Hannibal pivoted. He couldn't crush Rome by siege, so he would strangle her by alliance. He turned his gaze south, to the Greek city-states of Magna Graecia. Capua, the second city of Italy, opened its gates to him, seduced by promises of dominance. One by one, cities that had chafed under Roman rule began to defect. The image of the invincible Carthaginian general was a powerful lure. Hannibal was no longer just a general, he was a kingmaker, redrawing the map of Italy. But Rome, with a stubbornness that would become legendary, saw every defection as a new wound to heal with steel. The war was no longer a single clash of armies, it had become a brutal, sprawling insurgency. Rome's response was not panic, but a cold, calculated fury. The Senate understood that Hannibal needed allies to survive. So they would deny him those allies. They dispatched armies, small but relentless, to shadow his movements, to punish any city that dared to open its gates to him. The siege of Capua became a grim symbol of Roman tenacity. They could not defeat Hannibal in the field, so they would starve him out, city by city. This strategy, born of desperation, was brutally effective. But it also gave Hannibal an opening. He marched north, hoping to relieve the pressure on Capua by threatening Rome itself. His cavalry appeared outside the city walls, a terrifying sight that sent a shudder through the Senate. Yet, he did not attack. He marched his army within 3 miles of the city, a monumental act of psychological warfare. The gesture was a gamble, a calculated bluff that Rome would recall its armies to defend its hearth and home. But the Senate, hardened by a year of catastrophe, saw through the ruse and refused to flinch. Hannibal was forced to slink back south, his grand gesture a hollow echo. While Hannibal's grand march on Rome fizzled, a different kind of war was being waged on the island of Sicily. The city of Syracuse, a Greek powerhouse, had thrown its lot in with Carthage. Its ruler, Hieronymus, was young and ambitious, dreaming of expelling Rome from the island. But Rome couldn't allow this. A Carthaginian foothold in Sicily threatened their very lifeline. They sent an army under the command of a seasoned general, Marcus Claudius Marcellus. He was a man of action, the sword of Rome, a stark contrast to the shield of Fabius. Marcellus laid siege to Syracuse, expecting a quick victory against a city unprepared for a long war. But he was met with a terrifying genius. The city's defenses were not just walls and towers, they were a labyrinth of deadly inventions crafted by the mind of one man, Archimedes. Claws of iron that reached out from the walls to grab and capsize Roman ships. Catapults that hurled massive boulders. And stories, perhaps exaggerated, of mirrors that set sails ablaze with focused sunlight. The siege became a battle of wits, a clash between Roman engineering and Greek brilliance. Marcellus was humiliated. For 2 years, his legions were held at bay by a single old man and his machines. The siege of Syracuse became a legend, a testament to the power of intellect over brute force. But no wall is eternal, no genius infallible. In 212 BC, a Roman patrol found a weak point in the city's defenses, a tower left unguarded during a festival. Under the cover of night, Roman soldiers scaled the walls and opened the gates. The city fell. Marcellus, filled with a mix of rage and admiration, ordered that Archimedes be brought to him unharmed. He wanted to meet the mind that had defied him for so long. But in the chaos of the sack, a Roman soldier stumbled upon an old man drawing geometric figures in the sand. The soldier, not knowing who he was, demanded he come. Archimedes, lost in his thoughts, reportedly said, "Do not disturb my circles." The soldier, enraged, ran him through with his sword. Rome had conquered Syracuse, but at the cost of one of antiquity's greatest minds. The war was now consuming not just armies, but the very future of knowledge itself. With Syracuse crushed, Rome could turn its full attention back to Hannibal. But the war in Italy was a quagmire. Hannibal, still undefeated in the field, roamed the south, a master of maneuver, always one step ahead. He was a phantom, striking where Rome was weak, then vanishing into the mountains. In 210 BC, a new consul took command. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, the young survivor of Cannae. He was now a man of 25, with a burning ambition not just to fight Hannibal, but to outthink him. He studied Hannibal's tactics, his use of cavalry, his ability to read a battlefield. He proposed a radical, audacious plan to the Senate: instead of chasing Hannibal around Italy, why not invade Africa, Carthage's homeland, and force him to come to them? The older senators, men like Fabius Maximus, were horrified. It was a reckless gamble, they argued. But Scipio was persuasive. He was the new Rome, the one that had learned from its defeats. The Senate, reluctantly, gave him the command in Spain, the first step on his grand design. He was to sever Carthage's lifeline of silver and soldiers. Scipio's gamble in Spain was more than just a military campaign, it was a race against time. While he was carving his path to glory, his father and uncle were fighting their own desperate war against Hannibal Barca, Hannibal's brother. The Barca family was a hydra: cut off one head, and another grows back. Hasdrubal was a brilliant commander in his own right, and he was dreaming of following his brother's footsteps, of marching across the Alps to reinforce Hannibal in Italy. If those two armies ever joined, Rome would be crushed. Scipio knew this. His mission was not just to conquer, but to prevent that catastrophic reunion. He moved with lightning speed, catching the Carthaginian forces off guard and scattering them. In a series of brilliant campaigns, he captured the heart of Carthaginian Spain, the city of New Carthage. But even as he secured his foothold, he heard whispers from the vast deserts of North Africa. A new power was rising, a kingdom of fierce horsemen called Numidia. Their king was a young, ruthless warrior named Massinissa, and he was aligning himself with Carthage. Scipio's plan to invade Africa was growing more dangerous by the day. He would need allies of his own. What really happened between these two young, ambitious commanders? How did their fates become so tangled? Subscribe now, and in the next part, we'll uncover the secret alliance that would seal the fate of Carthage. Scipio landed on the coast of Spain with a force that was smaller than anyone thought possible. The Roman Senate had given him just 2 legions, barely enough to hold a defensive line. But Scipio wasn't here to defend. He was here to attack. His first target was the city of New Carthage, the jewel of Carthaginian Spain. It held the enemy's treasury, their arsenals, and their hostages from every loyal tribe. If he could take it, he would cripple the Carthaginian war machine. But the city was heavily fortified, garrisoned by thousands and protected by a lagoon on one side. Everyone thought he was mad to even try. Scipio had a plan, but he told no one. He waited for the right moment, watching the tides, studying the walls, and listening to the whispers of local fishermen. He knew that a secret lay beneath the waters of the lagoon, a secret that would open the gates of New Carthage. The night before the assault, Scipio revealed his secret. A local guide had told him that the lagoon beside the city was shallow enough to wade through at low tide. While the main force attacked the walls from the north, a picked group of soldiers would cross the lagoon, scaling the undefended southern wall. It was a gamble that could end in total disaster. If the water was too deep, if the tide didn't drop, if the sentries spotted them, they'd be slaughtered in the mud. But Scipio had faith in his luck, and in his ability to read both men and nature. At dawn, the assault began. The Carthaginian defenders rushed to the northern walls, expecting the main attack. The noise was deafening, the clash of shields and the screams of the wounded. And then, as the tide receded, Scipio's elite soldiers waded through the shallows, silent and unseen. They reached the southern wall, planted their ladders, and climbed. The city of New Carthage fell in a single day. Scipio had achieved the impossible, and the name of Rome was suddenly feared again. But Scipio's victory was more than just a military triumph. He understood that this war would be won not just by swords, but by loyalty. Among the hostages taken in New Carthage were the sons and daughters of many Iberian chieftains. These were the people who could decide the fate of Spain. The Carthaginians had treated them as bargaining chips, useful only for their value in exchange. Scipio did something completely different. He treated them with honor, with kindness, with respect. He returned them to their families without demanding ransom. He even returned a beautiful young woman, captured by his soldiers, to her fiancé, a chieftain named Lucius, along with the gold that her family had brought as ransom. The story spread like wildfire across the Iberian Peninsula. The Roman general was not just a conqueror, he was a man of honor. And in the brutal world of ancient warfare, that was a weapon more powerful than any siege engine. The tribes began to flock to his banner, seeing Rome as a liberator, not a tyrant. Scipio was building an army of allies, one act of kindness at a time. While Scipio was winning hearts and cities in Spain, Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal was playing a desperate game of his own. He had watched Scipio's rise with growing alarm. His forces were being pushed back, his allies were defecting. He knew that if he stayed in Spain, he would eventually be cornered and destroyed. But there was another path, a path that could change the entire course of the war. Hasdrubal decided to do what his brother had done years before, march across the Alps and invade Italy. He would join forces with Hannibal, and together, they would crush Rome. The plan was bold, but it was also a gamble. He had to cross enemy territory, evade Scipio's patrols, and survive the treacherous mountain passes. His army was a shadow of what it had been, but it was still a formidable force. He slipped away from Scipio's grasp, moving north with surprising speed. His destination was the Pyrenees, then the Rhone, then the Alps. If he succeeded, Rome would face not one, but two Hannibals. And the Roman Senate, still reeling from Cannae, knew that they had to stop him at all costs. The Roman Senate was in a panic. They had two armies now, one in Spain, one in Italy. They couldn't afford to let Hasdrubal break through. They needed a commander who could stop him, and they found one in a man named Marcus Livius Salinator. Livius was a stern, unpopular figure, but he was a fighter. He was sent north with an army to block Hasdrubal's advance. Meanwhile, another Roman army, under the consul Gaius Claudius Nero, was shadowing Hannibal in the south. The situation was like a deadly game of chess, with pieces moving across the board of Italy. Hasdrubal knew he had to get a message to his brother, to coordinate their movements. He sent 6 messengers, riding through enemy territory, carrying letters that described his route and his plans. But the messengers were captured by Roman patrols. And when they were brought before Claudius Nero, he saw an opportunity. He would use these captured letters, and a desperate gamble, to destroy the brothers one by one. The fate of Rome hung on a single, bold deception. Claudius Nero made a decision that would echo through history. He took a picked force of his best troops and marched north, under cover of darkness, to join Livius Salinator. He left behind a skeleton force with fires burning and trumpets sounding to fool Hannibal into thinking the Roman army was still in camp. It was a race against time. Hasdrubal was approaching the Metaurus River in northern Italy, unaware that the trap was closing. For days, the Roman armies marched, covering incredible distances, driven by the fear of what would happen if they failed. They finally met Hasdrubal's army on the banks of the Metaurus. The battle that followed was brutal and chaotic. Hasdrubal, realizing he was outnumbered, tried to escape, but his army was caught between the two Roman forces. In the end, his army was annihilated, and Hasdrubal himself was killed. The Romans, in a savage act of psychological warfare, cut off his head and threw it into Hannibal's camp. The message was clear: your brother is dead, and your dream of victory is over. Hannibal, for the first time, truly knew that he could not win this war. What did that moment do to his psyche? How did Rome's most feared enemy react to the death of his brother? Subscribe and hit the bell. In the next part, we'll uncover the final years of Hannibal's war, the rise of Scipio, and the secret alliance that would seal Carthage's fate. The head of Hasdrubal Barca rolled into the dirt, a gruesome trophy wrapped in the blood-soaked cloth of a Carthaginian standard. When the Roman cavalry hurled it into Hannibal's camp, the message was unmistakable. For the first time in 15 years of war, the man who had terrified Rome itself stood silent, staring at the severed face of his brother. The camp fell quiet. No war cries, no defiant speeches. Just the heavy, suffocating weight of a dream collapsing. Hannibal had lost battles before, but he had never lost family. Hasdrubal was not just a general, he was the last thread connecting Hannibal to the hope of reinforcement. Now, that thread was snapped. He retreated into his tent, and for days, the soldiers heard nothing but silence. The legend who had crossed the Alps was now a man trapped in a foreign land, watching his army rot away. Rome was bleeding, but so was Carthage. And in that moment of shared agony, a new question burned in the minds of the Roman Senate: if they couldn't kill Hannibal, how could they ever force him to leave? While Hannibal mourned, a different fire was burning in the heart of a young Roman commander. Publius Cornelius Scipio, barely in his 20s, had been given a virtually impossible task: to drive the Carthaginians out of Spain. The Senate expected him to fail, to become just another casualty in a war that seemed endless. But Scipio was not like the other Roman generals. He didn't just mimic Hannibal's tactics, he studied them, dissected them, and then reinvented them for Rome. In Spain, he found a fractured Carthaginian command, divided between the surviving Barca brothers and a general named Mago. Scipio didn't attack with brute force. He moved with speed and audacity, striking at New Carthage, the heart of Carthaginian power in the peninsula. He captured the city in a single day, seizing hostages, treasure, and, most importantly, a shipyard that gave Rome a naval base in the west. But his true genius was political. He treated the Spanish tribes with respect, returning their hostages and promising them freedom from Carthaginian rule. He was building an empire of loyalty, not just an army of conquest. Rome was learning to fight like Hannibal, and that was a terrifying thought for Carthage. The conquest of Spain was not just a military victory, it was a psychological one. Scipio had achieved what no Roman general had managed in a decade. He had taken the war to the enemy and won. The Carthaginian hold on Spain, the source of their silver mines and mercenary manpower, was crumbling. Hasdrubal Gisco, another Carthaginian general, tried to rally resistance, but he was outmaneuvered at the Battle of Becula. Scipio's victory was decisive but not complete. He allowed a portion of the Carthaginian army to slip away, a tactical error that would have consequences. That escaping army, led by Hasdrubal Barca, was the one that marched toward Italy, only to meet its doom at the Metaurus. The irony was bitter. Scipio's victory in Spain inadvertently set the stage for the very battle that broke Hannibal's spirit. But Scipio didn't see it that way. He saw an opportunity. With Spain secured, Rome had a new base of power. And from that base, Scipio began to dream of a bolder, more dangerous plan. He wanted to attack Carthage itself. The Senate, still recovering from the trauma of Cannae, was horrified. They had spent years just trying to survive Hannibal. The idea of opening a new front in Africa was madness. But Scipio was relentless, and his ambition was contagious. Scipio returned to Rome a hero, a man with a plan that defied all conventional wisdom. He stood before the Senate, a chamber filled with aging consuls who had grown old fighting a war they couldn't win. They listened as he laid out his audacious strategy, to invade North Africa, Carthage's homeland, and force Hannibal to abandon Italy. Many laughed. They called him a madman, a boy playing at war. They argued that Hannibal was the real threat, and that sending troops to Africa would leave Italy defenseless. But Scipio had a powerful ally, the people of Rome. They were tired of the endless stalemate, the burning farms, the constant fear. They saw in Scipio a spark of the old Roman fire, a willingness to take risks. The Senate, pressured by public opinion, reluctantly granted him the command of Sicily, with permission to cross to Africa if he saw fit. But they gave him no army. He had to recruit his own veterans, men who had survived Cannae and were hungry for revenge. These were hardened soldiers, loyal to Scipio, not to the Senate. They were an army of outcasts and survivors, and they were willing to follow their young general into the heart of the enemy's empire. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean. In the south of Italy, Hannibal watched the news from Rome with a growing sense of unease. He was a general without a war to fight. The Romans refused to meet him in a decisive battle, and his army, though still loyal, was melting away from desertion and disease. He had no reinforcements, no supplies, and no hope of victory. He was a king without a kingdom, holding a shrinking patch of Italian soil. Then, the reports came of Scipio's preparations in Sicily. Hannibal knew what it meant. The Romans were going to attack Carthage, and he was powerless to stop them. He sent desperate messages to the Carthaginian Senate, begging them to prepare their defenses, to recall him from Italy. But the merchants of Carthage were as arrogant as ever. They believed their city was impregnable, protected by its walls and its navy. They refused to recall Hannibal, thinking he could still be useful as a diversion. It was a fatal miscalculation. Hannibal, the master of strategic offense, was now trapped in a defensive war he had never wanted. For years, he had been the hunter, choosing when and where to strike. Now, he was the prey, waiting for his enemy to make the first move. The tables had turned, and the entire balance of power in the Mediterranean was about to shift. Scipio's fleet finally set sail from Sicily, a massive armada of warships and transports carrying over 25,000 veteran soldiers. They landed near Utica, a city not far from Carthage itself. The Carthaginian Senate was caught completely off guard. They had been so focused on Hannibal in Italy that they had ignored the threat from the sea. Scipio moved quickly, not to siege Carthage directly, but to ravage the rich countryside and win over the local Numidian tribes. This was where the young king Massinissa, a man who had been courted by both Rome and Carthage, finally made his choice. He threw his formidable cavalry, the finest horsemen in Africa, behind Scipio. This alliance was a death blow to Carthaginian hopes. With Massinissa's Numidian cavalry, Scipio now had a force that could match the legendary Carthaginian horsemen. The Carthaginians, in their panic, mustered a new army and sent it against Scipio, but they were crushed in a night attack that burned their camp. The path to Carthage was now clear. The Senate in Carthage had only one card left to play. They recalled Hannibal from Italy. The man who had spent 16 years trying to conquer Rome was now being called home to save his own city. This was the moment that would define everything. The two greatest generals of the age, Hannibal and Scipio, were finally on a collision course, not in Italy, but on the plains of Africa. The war was about to come full circle, and the fate of the ancient world would be decided in a single, final battle. What could Hannibal possibly do with a battered, demoralized army against the fresh, confident legions of Scipio? Subscribe and hit the bell. We'll break down the final, brutal showdown at Zama next. The summons came to Hannibal like a physical blow. After 16 years of war on Italian soil, after victories that had rewritten the rules of warfare, he was being ordered to abandon Italy and return to Africa. Not to triumph, but to defend a homeland that had never truly believed in him. The Carthaginian Senate, the very men who had starved him of reinforcements for years, now begged for his salvation. Think about the irony. The general they had abandoned was their last hope. He was standing on the deck of a small ship, watching the coast of Italy fade into the mist. For a moment, he was silent. He had faced Roman legions, treacherous allies, and the brutal Italian winters. But this was the hardest order he had ever received. He was leaving behind his wounded, his veterans, and the dream of a Carthaginian empire on Roman soil. As the ship turned south, Hannibal knew he was sailing toward his destiny. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Across the sea, Scipio was not idle. He had spent months drilling his army, forging them into a weapon that could defeat the Carthaginian phalanx. He knew that Hannibal was coming, and he knew that the final battle would not be won by brute force, but by strategy. Scipio studied his enemy. He knew Hannibal's genius for ambush, his ability to read a battlefield. So he prepared something new. He incorporated the Numidian cavalry into his tactics, not just as scouts, but as a decisive strike force. He also forged a weapon of his own, the Spanish sword, longer and more flexible than the traditional Roman gladius. His men drilled relentlessly, learning to fight in smaller, more mobile units that could respond to Hannibal's maneuvers. And he waited. He watched the Carthaginian army assemble on the plains near Zama. He saw the war elephants lined up in the front, the infantry behind them, and the cavalry on the wings. It was a formation designed to crush the enemy on the first charge. But Scipio had seen it before. He knew exactly what to do. On the morning of the battle, the two armies faced each other across a wide, dusty plain. Hannibal had about 50,000 men, including 80 war elephants. Scipio had a similar number, but his cavalry, under Massinissa and Laelius, was superior. Both generals rode along their lines, speaking to their men. Hannibal's speech was a reminder of past glories. He told his veterans that this was the final battle, that victory would mean the survival of their homeland. Scipio's words were sharper. He reminded his legions of Cannae, of the 70,000 Romans who had been butchered. He told them this was the day to avenge their fathers, their brothers, and their sons. The tension was unbearable. Then, the Carthaginian war elephants began to charge. The ground shook under their weight. But Scipio had a surprise. His men opened their ranks, creating lanes of escape, and the elephants, confused and frightened by the noise of the Roman trumpets, were channeled harmlessly through the gaps. Some were turned back into the Carthaginian lines, causing chaos. The first wave was over. The real battle was about to begin. With the elephants neutralized, the infantry clashed. The Roman legions advanced with their new, flexible maniples, while the Carthaginian center, made up of Hannibal's veteran African infantry, fought with a ferocity born of desperation. It was a brutal, grinding melee. In the meantime, the Roman cavalry, led by Massinissa and Laelius, had driven the Carthaginian horsemen off the field. But instead of chasing them, they regrouped. This was the key to Scipio's plan. He had ordered his cavalry to hold their position, to wait for the signal. The infantry battle raged on. Scipio's line began to waver under the pressure of Hannibal's veterans. The Carthaginian general saw his chance. He ordered his final reserve, his own veterans who had fought with him in Italy, to advance and smash the Roman center. It was a desperate gamble. If this attack succeeded, the battle would be over. If it failed, there would be nothing left. The two forces met in a cloud of dust. Swords clashed, shields broke, and men died by the hundreds. For a moment, it seemed Hannibal's gamble might pay off. The Roman line started to bend. But Scipio had anticipated this moment. He had held back his own elite triarii, his most experienced soldiers, as a reserve. As Hannibal's veterans slammed into his center, Scipio ordered his triarii to advance and reinforce the line. At the same time, he gave the signal he had been waiting for. He sent a messenger to Massinissa, ordering the Roman cavalry to charge back into the battle. The Numidian cavalry, which had been waiting on the flanks, now swept down on the rear of the Carthaginian army. The impact was devastating. Hannibal's army, which had been on the verge of breaking the Roman center, was now surrounded. The battle turned into a massacre. The Carthaginian army, trapped between the Roman infantry and the returning cavalry, was annihilated. Hannibal, watching from his position, saw his entire life's work crumble before his eyes. He saw his veterans, the men who had followed him over the Alps and through 16 years of war, being cut down. There was no escape. The battle was lost. With a heavy heart, he gathered a small group of his personal guard and fled the field. He had lost everything. The city of Carthage, his home, was now defenseless. The Battle of Zama was over. Scipio had achieved what no Roman general had ever done, he had defeated Hannibal Barca in a pitched battle. The cost was immense, but the victory was absolute. As the dust settled, Scipio walked among the dead, surveying the field. It was a scene of unimaginable horror. Over 20,000 Carthaginians lay dead. But Scipio was not triumphant. He was a man who understood the weight of his actions. He had not just won a battle, he had ended a war that had lasted for 17 years. The power of Carthage, the great maritime empire, was broken. Their fleet was gone, their army destroyed, and their treasury was empty. Scipio would be given the title Africanus for his victory. But what of Hannibal? He escaped to Hadramedum, a city further south, where he would spend the next few years as a fugitive, a shadow of his former self. The man who had brought Rome to its knees was now a broken man, watching his world collapse. Rome, on the other hand, was now the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. But peace would not last. The seeds of the next conflict, the Third Punic War, were already being sown in the ashes of Carthage. The Roman Senate, driven by fear and hatred, would not be satisfied until the city itself was razed to the ground. But that is a story for another time. For now, the war was over. But who would rise from the ruins of Hannibal's dream, and what dark secret would drive Rome to commit the ultimate act of destruction? The victory at Zama wasn't just a military triumph, it was a death sentence, written in blood and ash. Scipio Africanus, the man who had outthought Hannibal on the battlefield, now dictated the terms of peace with a cold, unforgiving precision. The Carthaginian Senate had no choice. They were forced to surrender their entire war fleet, all but a handful of ships, and pay an astronomical war indemnity that would cripple their economy for generations. But the most humiliating clause was the one that stripped Carthage of its empire. Every territory outside Africa, every island, every trading post that had once made them the masters of the Mediterranean, was handed over to Rome. The city that had once ruled the waves was now a vassal state, its power broken, its pride shattered. And as the Carthaginian senators signed the treaty, they knew this was not a peace. It was merely a pause before the final storm. For Hannibal, the defeat at Zama was more than a lost battle, it was the collapse of a lifetime of dreams. He had sworn to destroy Rome, to avenge his father's hatred, and to make Carthage the undisputed queen of the Mediterranean. For 16 years, he had marched through Italy, winning battle after battle, turning Roman rivers red with their blood. He had come so close. And yet, in a single afternoon on a dusty plain in North Africa, it was all gone. He fled to the city of Hadramedum, a broken man, carrying only the weight of his failure. But even in exile, Hannibal was not a man to fade into obscurity. He was a survivor. He watched, he waited, and he planned. He knew the peace treaty was a farce, a temporary wound that Rome would exploit. He knew that the only way to save Carthage was to rebuild its strength in secret, to bide his time, and to strike back when Rome least expected it. The lion was wounded, but he was not yet dead. While Hannibal licked his wounds in exile, a new and far more dangerous enemy was rising in Rome. His name was Marcus Porcius Cato, a senator of the old school, a man whose heart was filled with a burning, irrational hatred for Carthage. Cato was not a soldier like Scipio, he was a politician, a master of rhetoric, and he knew how to stoke the fears of the Roman people. He watched the Carthaginian wealth begin to trickle back, saw their merchants trading again, and he saw a threat. He saw a rival that, if left unchecked, would one day rise again and challenge Rome's supremacy. So, he began a campaign of fear. In every speech, at every public assembly, no matter the topic, he would end his oration with the same two chilling words, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. He repeated this mantra so often, with such conviction, that it became a part of the Roman psyche. He turned a defeated enemy into a monstrous specter, a threat so great that its complete annihilation became not just a policy, but a sacred duty. The decades that followed Zama were a time of uneasy peace, but the hatred in Rome never cooled. They watched Carthage like a hawk watches a wounded prey, waiting for any sign of weakness or defiance. And Carthage, under the leadership of Hannibal's political allies, began to rebuild. Their fields were fertile, their harbors were busy again, and their merchants were growing wealthy. It was a resurgence that sent a jolt of pure fear through the Roman Senate. They sent envoys to Carthage, demanding that Hannibal be handed over, but he had already fled once more, this time to the east, to stir up trouble against Rome among the Hellenistic kingdoms. His departure did not soothe Rome's fears. If anything, it made them worse. Now, their most feared enemy was free, a ghost who could appear anywhere, rallying anyone against them. The Roman Senate decided they had had enough. They could not tolerate a powerful, independent Carthage. It was too dangerous. And so, they began to manufacture a pretext for war. They made impossible demands, knowing full well Carthage would refuse. It was a cruel game, a trap designed to lead to the inevitable conclusion, the complete and utter destruction of their ancient rival. The pretext came in 149 BC, when a Numidian king named Massinissa, Rome's loyal ally, began to encroach on Carthaginian territory. He was a wolf sent to test the fences, and Carthage, desperate and backed into a corner, decided to defend itself. They armed their citizens and fought back against Massinissa's forces. It was a disaster. They were defeated, and Rome had its excuse. The elderly senators of Rome, fueled by Cato's relentless rhetoric, declared that Carthage had violated the treaty by waging war without Rome's permission. They sent a massive army to Africa, not to negotiate, but to dictate. The Carthaginians, terrified, sent envoys to Rome, begging for peace. Rome's response was brutal and final. They demanded that Carthage surrender all of its weapons, its war machines, and its fleet. The Carthaginians, hoping to save their city, complied. They handed over everything. But Rome had one final, impossible demand: the Carthaginians must abandon their city, move inland, and never live within 10 miles of the sea. It was a death sentence. Carthage was a maritime civilization. Without the sea, it was nothing. The people realized that Rome didn't want peace. They wanted the complete obliteration of their way of life, their history, and their very existence. The demand to abandon their city broke the Carthaginian spirit. It was a final, cruel act of humiliation that turned their despair into a desperate, suicidal rage. They had been stripped of their army, their navy, and their weapons. But they had not been stripped of their will to live. In a frenzy of defiance, they shut their gates, tore down their buildings to forge new weapons, and used their women's hair to make ropes for catapults. They would fight to the last man, woman, and child. For 2 full years, the city of Carthage held out against the full might of Rome. It was a siege of unimaginable brutality, a war of extermination. And in the spring of 146 BC, the Roman army, led by Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the man who had defeated Hannibal, finally broke through the walls. For 6 days and nights, the Romans fought their way through the city, street by street, house by house, in a frenzy of killing and looting. The city that had been Rome's greatest rival for over a century was reduced to a smoldering pile of rubble. The city was razed to the ground, its surviving citizens sold into slavery. The ground was plowed with salt, a curse to ensure nothing would ever grow there again. Rome had committed the ultimate act of destruction. But was it a victory born of fear, or a crime born of hatred? And as the flames of Carthage died down, a new question haunted the Roman Senate: could a republic that had shown such cruelty ever truly be free from the ghosts of its past? What would the man who had once spared Rome, the great Hannibal, have thought of this final, horrifying act? And what dark secret, hidden in the ashes, would Rome's own future emperor, a man named Julius Caesar, seek to bury when he ordered the city to be rebuilt a century later? If you want to uncover the secrets buried beneath that cursed ground, and witness the next chapter of this epic struggle, hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss what happens next. The smoke from Carthage's pyre could be seen from the sea for days. Scipio Aemilianus stood on the deck of his flagship, watching the city he had just annihilated burn into the night. He was the adopted grandson of the man who had defeated Hannibal, but this victory felt different. It wasn't a glorious triumph, it was a slaughter. As the flames licked the sky, he was said to have wept, quoting Homer's words about the fall of Troy. He knew that all cities, all empires, all civilizations eventually meet the same fate. And he couldn't shake the feeling that Rome had just written its own death warrant. By erasing Carthage from the face of the earth, had they not also erased the one thing that kept them disciplined, the one rival that forced them to be strong? With Carthage gone, who would keep Rome honest? The answer, he feared, was no one. For the Romans, the destruction of Carthage was the ultimate proof of their invincibility. They had eliminated their greatest threat. They had avenged the ghosts of Cannae and Trasimene. The triumph celebrated in Rome was unlike anything the city had ever seen. The spoils of war were displayed for weeks, and the people cheered for their new hero, Scipio Aemilianus. But the Senate, the old patrician families, and the ambitious politicians were already moving on to a new game. With the external enemy gone, the internal struggle for power was about to begin. The wealth of Carthage flooded into Rome, enriching some families while leaving others behind. The old virtues of the Republic, the discipline of the farmer-soldier, were being replaced by the greed of the merchant and the cunning of the politician. The Republic that had conquered the world was now at risk of being conquered by its own success. Yet, in the quiet corners of the Roman world, whispers of unease began to circulate. The destruction of Carthage had not just been a military victory, it had been an act of absolute annihilation. The Romans had salted the earth, a ritual act of cursing the land so that nothing could ever grow there again. It was a brutal, primal act, and many wondered if they had gone too far. They had not just defeated an enemy, they had erased a civilization. The gods, some whispered, do not look kindly upon such pride. The ghost of Hannibal, the man who had humiliated Rome for 16 years, was still a legend. But the ghost of the city itself, with its children crying, its women screaming, its temples burning, was a heavier burden. Scipio Aemilianus felt it most keenly. He had been forced to do this terrible thing, and now he was its prisoner. The political landscape of Rome was shifting in ways no one could have predicted. The old families, the Scipios and the Fabii, were still powerful, but a new breed of politician was emerging. Men like Cato the Elder, who had died just a few years before the final destruction of Carthage, had preached a return to old Roman values, simplicity, frugality, and a hatred of luxury. But his death seemed to open the floodgates to the very excess he had warned against. The new Roman aristocracy, enriched by conquest, began to buy up land, pushing small farmers off their plots. These displaced farmers, once the backbone of the Roman army, now crowded the streets of Rome, landless and restless. The Republic was becoming a place of immense wealth and immense poverty, a powder keg waiting for a spark. The question on everyone's mind, though spoken only in hushed tones, was who would light it. Scipio Aemilianus, the hero of the hour, watched these developments with growing dread. He was a soldier, a man of action, not a politician. But he understood that the Republic was sick. The corruption, the greed, the infighting, it was all spreading like a disease. He had seen what happened when a city lost its sense of purpose. He had just burned it to the ground. But Rome was heading down the same path. He retreated from public life, spending more time in his library with the Greek philosophers and historians he so admired. It was there, surrounded by scrolls, that he received news of his adopted grandfather's death. Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated Hannibal at Zama, the man who had been the greatest Roman of his age, had died in self-imposed exile, a bitter man, disillusioned with the Republic he had saved. His last words, some said, were a warning about the greed that would consume Rome. The death of Scipio Africanus marked the end of an era. The last great man who had fought Hannibal was gone. With him died the memory of the old Republic, the Republic of virtuous farmers and selfless senators. The new Rome, the Rome that had crushed Carthage, was a different beast. It was rich, powerful, and utterly without mercy. And as Scipio Aemilianus stood by the funeral pyre of his grandfather, he couldn't help but think of another pyre, the one he had lit in Carthage. The ghosts of that city, he knew, would not be easily silenced. They would haunt Rome for a century. They would whisper in the ears of ambitious generals and corrupt senators. They would fuel civil wars and the rise of tyrants. The destruction of Carthage was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a much darker one for Rome itself. What cursed inheritance would this act of annihilation leave for the next generation? And what man, born from the ashes of the old republic, would rise to claim it? If you want to see how the ghost of Carthage comes back to consume the Roman Republic, and the chilling secret that Julius Caesar himself would try to bury, then smash that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss the next chapter. Rome was drunk on victory, but the wine had turned to poison. The treasures of Carthage, of Greece, of the entire Mediterranean, flowed into the city like a tidal wave. But with that gold came a rot. The old virtues of frugality and duty were drowned in a sea of luxury and vice. Senators who once plowed their own fields now threw orgies that cost more than a legion's annual pay. The gap between the ultra-rich and the poor widened into an abyss. And in that abyss, a new kind of politician was born, not a soldier, not a statesman, but a demagogue who bought votes with bread and circuses. The Republic, which had survived Hannibal's elephants and the rage of the gods, was now facing a far more insidious enemy, its own insatiable greed. The very thing that had made Rome great was now threatening to tear it apart. Into this powder keg stepped a man who seemed to come from another age, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. He was a young aristocrat, but unlike his peers, he was haunted by what he saw on the roads of Italy. The lands that had once been farmed by proud Roman citizens were now vast estates worked by chains of slaves. The very men who had conquered the world were being pushed off their land, left with nothing. So Tiberius did the unthinkable. He ran for tribune of the plebs, a position meant to protect the common man, and he proposed a law to redistribute public land to the poor. He wasn't a radical, not at first. He was a patriot trying to save the Republic from dying of a self-inflicted wound. But to the Senate, to the wealthy elite, he was an enemy of the state, a traitor who was trying to tear down their entire way of life. The Senate's response was not with words, but with blood. When Tiberius Gracchus sought re-election to continue his reforms, a mob of senators and their clients, armed with clubs and broken benches, stormed the Capitoline Hill. They beat the tribune and 300 of his supporters to death. His body was thrown into the Tiber River, denied even a proper burial. It was the first time in the history of the Republic that political violence had been used to silence an opponent. The old rules, the unwritten code that governed the struggle between the classes, had been shattered. Tiberius Gracchus was dead, but his cause lived on. He had planted a seed of resentment in the heart of the Roman poor, a seed that would grow into a forest of daggers. Rome had just killed a tribune, and the ghosts of that murder would never be exorcised. It was a turning point, a bloody line drawn in the dust of the Forum. Scipio Aemilianus watched the Republic descend into madness. He was the greatest living Roman, the conqueror of Carthage, but he was powerless to stop it. He was the leader of the conservative faction, the Optimates, who believed the Senate should rule. He saw the Gracchi as dangerous radicals, but he also saw the greed of his own class. He was a man caught in the middle, a man who could see both sides of the abyss. When he was found dead in his bed one morning, the city was shocked. There was no sign of a struggle, no wound on his body. Some said he died of natural causes, worn out by years of service. But others whispered a darker truth. His wife, Sempronia, was the sister of the Gracchi brothers. And she had been seen arguing with him the night before. The death of Scipio Aemilianus remains a mystery to this day, but it was a reminder that in this new Rome, even the most revered heroes were not safe. While Rome was tearing itself apart, the land of her greatest enemy lay silent and cursed. The Senate, in a final act of spite, had declared that the soil of Carthage was to be sown with salt, so that nothing would ever grow there again. But even that wasn't enough. They sold the very ashes of the city to speculators. The ground where Hannibal had walked, where the temples of Baal had stood, where 1 million people had lived, was now a barren wasteland, a quarry for Roman builders. Yet, the ghost of Carthage refused to die. The Roman people, in their hearts, knew what they had done was monstrous. They had committed an act of genocide, and they were now afraid of their own shadow. In the temples, priests whispered of a curse, that the gods of Carthage would have their revenge. This fear, this paranoia, hung over Rome like a cloud. It was the first crack in the marble facade of their invincibility. And then, from the dust of this crisis, a new kind of Roman emerged. He was not a senator, not a noble. His name was Gaius Marius, a novus homo, a new man. He was a soldier, a man of the people, who had clawed his way up the ranks through sheer ability. He saw that the Roman army was broken. The old citizen soldier, the farmer who fought for his land, was gone. So Marius did something revolutionary. He opened the legions to the landless poor. He gave them weapons, armor, and a promise: follow me, and you will be rich. He turned the army from a citizen militia into a professional fighting force. An army that was loyal not to Rome, but to its general. It was a brilliant solution to a pressing problem, but it was also a death sentence for the Republic. He had built the perfect machine for a tyrant. And in the decades to come, the men who commanded those legions would turn their swords on Rome itself. The ghost of Carthage had not just cursed the soil, it had cursed the future of the Republic. What new monster would this new army create? And what would it mean for the world that Rome had just conquered? But before the new army could turn on Rome, it had a more immediate target, a stubborn and corrupt king named Jugurtha. The war in Numidia was a scandal, a showcase of everything rotten in the Republic. Roman commanders, bribed by Jugurtha's gold, let him slip through their fingers time and time again. The Senate was humiliated, and the people were furious. They weren't just fighting a foreign king anymore, they were fighting their own corrupt nobility. And in the middle of this mess, Gaius Marius, the new man, saw his chance. He returned to Rome, not as a triumphant general, but as a political weapon. With the support of the people, he was elected consul and given a command in Africa, a command that was supposed to be reserved for the aristocracy. He was going to win this war, not for the Senate, but for the common man. The old guard ceded, but they couldn't stop him. The Republic was about to get its first taste of a truly popular general. Marius didn't just win the war in Numidia, he redefined what it meant to be a Roman soldier. He broke from the old rules. He recruited the landless poor, the capitansi, the men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. He gave them land, a share of the plunder, and a promise of a better life. In return, he demanded absolute loyalty. He drilled them relentlessly, turning them into a professional fighting machine the likes of which the Mediterranean had never seen. He didn't care if they were patricians or plebeians, he only cared if they could fight. The army became his own personal instrument of power. When Jugurtha was finally captured, it wasn't the Senate who brought him to Rome in chains, it was Marius. The victory was his, and his alone. The Republic had won a war, but it had also created a monster. A general with an army that owed its allegiance not to the state, but to him. The old balance of power, the delicate dance between Senate and people, had just been thrown out of balance, and the man holding the scales was Gaius Marius. But just as Marius was reshaping the army, a new storm was gathering on the northern horizon. A massive migration of Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and the Teutons, was sweeping down from the Baltic, looking for new lands to settle. They were a terrifying force, a whole people on the move, with their families, their cattle, and their war wagons. They had already crushed a Roman army in Gaul, a defeat so humiliating that the Senate had to send Marius to save them. He was elected consul again, and again, and again, an unprecedented act that broke the constitution and made him the most powerful man in Rome. The Senate, the nobility, they were all afraid of him, but they were even more afraid of the barbarians. They had no choice but to give him whatever he wanted. Marius, of course, took full advantage. He was no longer just a general, he was the savior of Rome. And he knew it. He prepared his new army to meet a foe unlike any other, a foe that did not fight for loot or glory, but for survival. The fate of the Republic rested on his shoulders, and he was determined to use every ounce of his political and military power to win. The clash came at a place called Aquae Sextii, in southern Gaul. Marius chose the battlefield carefully, a steep hill with a river at its base. He knew the Teutons were undisciplined and ferocious, but they lacked his tactical refinement. He placed his main force on the hill, and a hidden detachment in the woods behind the enemy's flank. The Teutons, seeing the Romans in a seemingly weak position, attacked with a full, screaming charge. The Roman line held, the soldiers bracing their shields against the furious assault. Then, at the perfect moment, the hidden column struck the enemy's flank and rear. The Germanic warriors were surrounded, trapped between the hill and the river. It was a massacre, not a battle. Tens of thousands were killed, and the threat was annihilated. Marius had saved Rome, but he had done so with a level of carnage that shocked even the hardened Romans. The victory was absolute, but it was also a warning. It showed the world that this new Roman army, the army of Marius, was the most lethal fighting force on earth. And it showed Rome that one man, one general, could wield that force with impunity. The Republic was no longer safe from its enemies. It was now less safe from its own heroes. But the ghost of Carthage was not done with Rome. The fear that had once been directed at the Punic enemy now turned inward. The Senate, the old aristocracy, looked at Marius and saw a new Hannibal, a man who could destroy their republic from within. They conspired against him, trying to strip him of his command and his glory. Marius, in turn, had no intention of giving up his power. He had saved Rome once, and he was prepared to do it again, but on his own terms. The political divisions in Rome deepened. The courts were overwhelmed with accusations of corruption and treason. The city was becoming a powder keg, and the figure of Marius was the fuse. The old rules, the old ways of doing things, were breaking down. The Republic was no longer a government of laws, but a battleground of personalities. And the rest of the world watched, waiting to see if this new monster, Rome, would tear itself apart before it could conquer them all. The triumph at Aquae Sextii had only postponed the inevitable. The stage was set for a civil war that would make the wars with Carthage look like a family squabble. And then, a new figure emerged from the chaos, a man who would become Marius's ultimate rival. His name was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician who had once served as Marius's quaestor in Numidia. Sulla was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. He had a gift for strategy and an even greater gift for political intrigue. The Senate, desperate for a champion to counter Marius, began to back him. Sulla was the perfect weapon, a nobleman who could play the political game as well as any general. He was sent to deal with a new threat in the east, a war against King Mithridates of Pontus, a man who had massacred thousands of Romans in Asia Minor. The command was a prize beyond measure, a chance for immense glory and wealth. Marius, seeing his rival getting such an opportunity, was consumed with envy. He used his political allies to have the command transferred to him. It was a direct insult to Sulla, a declaration of political war. And Sulla, instead of bowing to the Senate's decision, did the unthinkable. He marched his army on Rome itself. The first stone of the Republic's foundation was about to be cracked, not by a foreign enemy, but by its own general. What would happen when a Roman army, the most powerful force on earth, turned its swords on the eternal city. The die was cast. When Sulla's legions crossed the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome, they weren't just breaking a law, they were shattering the very soul of the Republic. No Roman general in history had ever dared to march on his own capital. The city, which had once trembled at the sight of Hannibal's army, now trembled at the sight of its own. Citizens fled as the tramp of hobnailed boots echoed through the Forum. The Senate, the proud body that had commanded the world, was reduced to a panicked mob. Sulla's message was clear: the old order was dead, and he was the one holding the sword. Marius, the hero of the north, the savior of Italy, was now a fugitive in the city he had once protected. The war with Carthage was a distant memory. This was a war of Romans against Romans, and it would be far more pitiless than anything Hannibal could have imagined. The city fell without a single battle for Sulla. He was the master of Rome, but not through policy or persuasion. He had the only thing that mattered in the end, the loyalty of the legions. Marius, the old general who had reformed that army, was now its victim. He fled the city, a broken man in his 70s, chased by Sulla's assassins. The Senate, browbeaten and terrified, did what it was told. They declared Marius a public enemy, a traitor. Sulla, for his part, was not interested in a long-term reign. He had a war to win in the east against Mithridates. But he couldn't leave a rival like Marius alive to stab him in the back. So, he set up a new government, a puppet regime loyal to him, and he took his legions east, leaving the city under the watch of his allies. He thought he had solved the problem. He was wrong. He had only opened the cage, and the beast of civil strife was now loose in the heart of the Republic. But Marius was not finished. He was a survivor, a creature of the marshes and hills of Italy. He escaped to Africa, landing on the very coast that had once been Carthage's heartland. The irony was not lost on him. He was an exile, a man without a country, just like Hannibal centuries before. But where Hannibal had dreamed of revenge against Rome, Marius only dreamed of getting back inside its walls. He gathered a ragtag army of veterans and runaway slaves. He was an old man, ravaged by age and bitterness, but his name still held power. In the cities of Italy, his supporters stirred. Sulla had left, and the patricians he'd put in charge were weak, corrupt, and loathed. The people of Rome, the same people who had cheered Marius for his victories, began to whisper his name again. The exile was becoming a legend, and legends are dangerous weapons. The stage for a second act of the civil war was set, and the return of Marius would be a storm of blood and fire. News of Marius's return spread like wildfire. He landed in Etruria, north of Rome, and his army grew larger with each passing day. The Roman Senate, Sulla's puppet government, sent an army to stop him. It was a futile gesture. The soldiers, many of whom had once served under Marius, simply defected to his side. The government's commander fled, but it was too late. Marius's forces, a mix of vengeful veterans and armed mobs, marched on Rome. This time, there was no Sulla to defend the city. The gates were opened by his sympathizers, and the city was delivered into his hands. Then began a reign of terror that made Sulla's occupation look like a friendly visit. Marius had a list of enemies, and he was determined to purge every single one of them. The streets of Rome ran red with the blood of senators, knights, and any nobleman who had ever crossed him. Heads were displayed in the Forum. The Republic was not just dying, it was being dismembered by its own savior. Marius's victory was hollow. He had achieved his revenge, but he was a dying man. Days after seizing the city, he was struck down by a fever. His reign of terror lasted just 2 weeks before he was gone, leaving behind a legacy of blood and a city in chaos. The man who had saved Rome from the barbarians had become its butcher. His death, however, was not the end of the nightmare. His allies, led by Cinna, a corrupt senator, continued the purges. They ruled with fear, but they were weak. They had no legitimacy, no great general, and no real support. The Republic was in a state of anarchy, ruled by violence and mob rule. And in the east, Sulla was winning his war against Mithridates. He was a brilliant commander, and his victory was complete. But he knew what was happening in Rome. His enemies were in power, and they had killed his friends. He had a choice: stay in Greece and enjoy his triumph, or return to Rome and face his enemies. For a man like Sulla, the choice was never in doubt. He was coming home, and his homecoming would be written in fire. Sulla's return was not a negotiation, it was a declaration of war. He landed in Italy with his veteran legions, the most feared fighting force in the world. The armies of the Marian faction, the men who had killed his friends, marched out to meet him. They were no match for Sulla's disciplined veterans. In a series of brutal battles, Sulla crushed them. He was not fighting a foreign enemy, he was fighting the very spirit of the Republic that had birthed him. His victory was absolute. He entered Rome as a conqueror. The Republic of the old patricians, of the Senate's rule, of the law, was dead. Sulla declared himself dictator, a position with unlimited power. He had a list, a much longer and more systematic list than Marius's. He was going to purge the state of all his enemies, and he would do it with the cold efficiency of a lawyer. The ghosts of Carthage must have howled with laughter. The great Republic, the destroyer of their city, had finally turned its fury upon itself. The cycle of violence was complete. But the question that would haunt the future remained: if this was the price of victory, what was the cost of peace? And who would be the next to walk this path of blood, to decide the fate of a world? That is a story for another time. If you want to see how a young man named Julius Caesar navigated this knife's edge, and what his ambition would cost the Republic, then make sure you subscribe and hit the bell. The war for Rome's soul was only just beginning. Sulla didn't just march into Rome, he invaded it. His legions flooded the streets like a tide of iron, and the city braced for slaughter. But Sulla was no raging barbarian, he was a cold, calculating aristocrat. He didn't want chaos, he wanted control. He declared himself dictator, a title that had been dormant for over a century, and the Senate, cowed and broken, ratified every whim he had. The proscription lists came next, longer and more methodical than Marius's ever were. They were nailed to the rostra, and every name on that list was a death sentence. Thousands were executed, their property confiscated, their families ruined. Rome watched its own sons bleed in the Forum, and the ghosts of Carthage must have wept for the irony. The city that had once destroyed its greatest enemy was now devouring itself. But Sulla was too smart to rule by fear alone. He understood that the Republic had been shattered, and he needed to rebuild it in his own image. He packed the Senate with his loyalists, men who owed their lives and fortunes to him. He stripped the tribunes of their power, the very office that had given the Gracchi a platform, and he made the Senate the supreme authority once more. He was trying to put the Republic back in a box, to freeze it in time, to undo the chaos of the last 50 years. It was a masterful political stroke, a constitution designed to last forever. He even stepped down as dictator, returning to private life, a move that shocked everyone. He had held absolute power and simply walked away. But his reforms were a bandage on a gaping wound. The sickness of ambition and violence that had infected Rome was far too deep. He had not saved the Republic, he had merely delayed its final collapse, and he had left a generation of young men who had learned that power came from the sword, not the law. While Sulla was reshaping Rome, a new figure was emerging from the shadows of his revolution. His name was Gnaeus Pompeius, but history would remember him as Pompey the Great. He was a brilliant young commander, a protégé of Sulla, who had proven his loyalty in the civil war. Sulla, ever the pragmatist, gave him a task: go to Sicily and then Africa, and root out the last remnants of the Marian resistance. Pompey was ruthless. He crushed the rebels with terrifying efficiency, and he didn't stop there. He executed their leaders without trial, and he did it all with a smile. He was young, handsome, and arrogant, believing he was destined for greatness. When he returned to Rome, he demanded a triumph, a grand parade of his victories. Sulla, the dictator, was initially hesitant, but Pompey was not to be denied. He pointed out that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, not the other way around, and that Sulla's power was fading. Sulla, for the first time, saw a reflection of his own unquenchable ambition in a younger man. He gave Pompey his triumph, but he also gave him a warning: beware of a young man who believes he is greater than his master. But even as Pompey basked in his glory, a different sort of storm was brewing in the heart of a young patrician. His name was Julius Caesar. He was a nephew of Marius, a fact that made him a target of Sulla's wrath. Sulla ordered him to divorce his wife, Cornelia, because her father was an enemy of the state. Caesar refused. It was a death sentence. He was stripped of his inheritance, his priesthood, and his place in society. He fled Rome, hunted, sick, and nearly penniless. He was just a teenager, but he had a will of iron. He was captured by Sulla's men, but he managed to bribe them with a king's ransom, a sum that was far beyond what he should have had. He escaped to the east, to the very provinces Sulla was trying to control. Here, he was just another exile, a nobody. But Sulla, ever the sharp judge of character, saw something in this defiant youth. When his advisors urged him to hunt Caesar down, Sulla reportedly said, "In that Caesar, there are many Mariuses." He had seen the fire, the unbending pride, the absolute refusal to kneel. He knew that the republic he was building would one day be threatened by this man, but he let him go. He was too tired to fight the future. Caesar's exile was not just a punishment, it was an education. He joined the Roman army in the east, and he fought in the shadows of the very men who had condemned him. He was a soldier, a staff officer, and a diplomat. He was sent to the court of King Nicomedes of Bithynia to secure a fleet, and he was so good at his job that rumors began to spread about his relationship with the king. Rumors that would follow him for the rest of his life. He won the civic crown, a prestigious military honor, for saving a fellow soldier's life in battle. He was brave, resourceful, and utterly ruthless. He was learning the art of war, the art of command, and the art of survival. He was not just waiting for the storm to pass, he was preparing for the one he would unleash. When news of Sulla's death reached him, he must have felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The old master was gone, and the world was opening up. He returned to Rome, a man with a new name, a new reputation, and a burning desire to carve his own path. The Republic had survived, but its greatest threat had just returned. Sulla was dead, but his shadow stretched over Rome like a scar. He had tried to heal the Republic, but he had only made the wound deeper. He left behind a legacy of blood, a constitution that was already failing, and a generation of men who had learned that violence was the only answer. Pompey was in Spain, fighting a rebellion. The Senate was back to its old games of jealousy and intrigue. And the young Julius Caesar was quietly making a name for himself as a lawyer and a speaker, his sharp tongue as deadly as any sword. He was charming, charismatic, and deeply in debt, a man on the make. He knew the old order was crumbling, and he was positioning himself for the fall. He was not just a survivor, he was a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Republic was a wounded beast, and the vultures were circling. The Punic Wars had ended with the complete destruction of Carthage, a city of dust and ashes. But the lesson had been learned too well. Rome had become Carthage. The question that hung in the air was not if the Republic would fall, but who would be the one to deliver the final blow? And was a young man named Caesar, a man who had refused to kneel to a dictator, already the answer to that question? If you want to see how this young master of fate rose from the ashes of Sulla's tyranny, and how his ambition would set the world on fire, then subscribe and hit the bell. The greatest chapter of Rome's story is about to begin. Caesar returned to Rome a different man. The exile who had left in fear was now a predator walking among sheep. He was not just a nobleman with a famous name, he was a man with a mission. He saw the Republic not as a sacred institution, but as a carcass waiting to be carved. He threw himself into politics with a ferocity that shocked the old guard. He threw lavish parties, funded by borrowed money from the richest men in Rome, buying influence and loyalty. He was a master of the people's heart, a man who knew how to speak to the crowd. Every speech was a performance, every gesture a calculated move. He was not just climbing the ladder, he was setting it on fire behind him. The Senate, still drunk on Sulla's legacy, saw him as a young upstart, a minor annoyance. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet was about to give way. Caesar was not playing their game, he was building a new one, and the stakes were nothing less than the soul of Rome. But Caesar knew that charm and money were not enough. He needed military glory, the ultimate currency of Roman power. He secured a post as a military tribune in Spain, far from the political games of the capital. It was a dangerous mission, a chance to prove his mettle, and he seized it with both hands. He led his troops with a reckless courage that earned him their undying loyalty. He defeated local tribes in lightning-fast campaigns, his name spreading through the ranks as a commander who fought alongside his men. He was not just an aristocrat playing at war, he was a soldier, a leader. He returned to Rome with a new reputation, not just as a politician, but as a man of action. Yet, this was just the first step. The path to the highest office, the consulship, was paved with gold, blood, and the corpses of political rivals. Caesar was ready to walk over all of them. The Republic was a stage, and he was determined to be its lead actor, even if it meant burning the whole theater down. Back in Rome, the political landscape was a minefield. Pompey the Great, fresh from his victories in the east, craved one thing: land for his veteran soldiers. The Senate, jealous of his power, refused to grant it. It was a deadlock, a crisis that threatened to tear the Republic apart. Caesar, ever the opportunist, saw his chance. He forged a secret alliance with Pompey and the wealthiest man in Rome, Crassus. It was a pact of convenience, a marriage of ambition and greed. Together, they could control Rome. The Senate was aghast, their carefully laid plans crumbling into dust. Caesar was elected consul, the highest office in the land, with the backing of his new allies. He pushed through laws that gave Pompey his land, Crassus his tax contracts, and himself a governorship in Gaul. The Republic was now a puppet, its strings pulled by 3 men. But this was not a stable alliance, it was a powder keg. Each man was a lion, and they were all sharing the same cage. The question was not if they would turn on each other, but when. Caesar's consulship was a masterpiece of political manipulation, but he knew his power was temporary. He needed a military command that would bring him lasting glory and a loyal army. He set his sights on Gaul, a vast and wealthy region that had long been a threat to Rome. The Senate, hoping to sideline him, gave him the province for 5 years. It was a decision that would seal the fate of the Republic. Caesar crossed the Rubicon, not as a rebel, but as a governor heading to his province. But Gaul was not a simple conquest. It was a brutal, 8-year war that would test every ounce of his military genius. He fought countless tribes, faced impossible odds, and committed atrocities that would shock the civilized world. He built bridges, besieged cities, and slaughtered entire populations. He was not just a conqueror, he was a force of nature. The Gallic Wars made him the wealthiest and most powerful man in Rome, with an army that was loyal to him alone. He was no longer just a politician, he was a warlord with a personal empire. The Republic was no longer a match for him, and the Senate knew it. The Gallic Wars were a horror show, but for Caesar, they were a necessary evil. He was not just fighting barbarians, he was fighting for his future. His victories made him a legend, but they also made him a target. The Senate, led by his old rival Cato and the jealous Pompey, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. They knew that if he came back with his legions, the Republic was finished. The order was a declaration of war. Caesar stood at the banks of the Rubicon, the boundary of his province. He knew that crossing it with his army was an act of treason, a crime punishable by death. He knew it would plunge Rome into a civil war. For a moment, he hesitated. But his ambition, his pride, his entire life's work, pushed him forward. He is said to have uttered the famous words, "The die is cast." He crossed the river, and the world was never the same. The Republic was doomed. The war against the Senate had begun. The ghost of Carthage, the city he had never seen, must have laughed in the underworld, for Rome was now tearing itself apart, just as it had torn Carthage apart. So, the question is no longer if the Republic will fall, but who will be the one to topple it. Is it Pompey, the aging general, defending the old order? Or is it Caesar, the master of the people, who has already crossed the Rubicon and is marching on Rome? Their clash is inevitable, a final, bloody reckoning. But in the shadows, a third force is stirring. It is the legacy of Carthage itself, a curse of ambition and destruction that has poisoned Rome's soul. The Punic Wars were supposed to be Rome's greatest victory, but they sowed the seeds of its own demise. Rome did not just defeat Carthage, it absorbed its ruthlessness, its corruption, its hunger for power. Now, Caesar is just the first of a new breed of warlords who will tear the Republic apart, and the world will be left to wonder, was there ever a choice? Or was Rome's fate sealed the moment its legions marched through the smoking ruins of Carthage? If you want to witness the final showdown between Caesar and Pompey, and how the ghost of Carthage will shape the birth of an empire, then smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. The greatest story of power, betrayal, and destiny is only just beginning.